Hello guys, my name is Hugo. Finally I got my Canon EOS R5 and I can make a review about it. Before we continue, I wanted to ask you to consider subscribing to my channel, turning on notifications and like button. This would really help me to be more motivated to do videos like this. Otherwise, how can I see if someone needs videos like this? And stay with me until the end to get answer to the most concerned question. Does it overheat? I want to make a statement up front. I respect Sony as much as I respect Canon. I've been a Sony user for over 5 years and I had used pretty much any Sony cameras that is out there. I'm not chasing the brand names, I just use what works better for me in my workflow. I honestly think that both Canon and Sony have released amazing cameras which provide more than anyone could really expect from them. When R5 has been released, every single person in the industry was talking about this camera, including pretty much all Sony users, considering to make a switch. Sony has released its a7S III and pretty much with this camera they kept all the Sony users, who almost made the switch. And after Sony release, suddenly so much hatred towards the Canon EOS R5. And what I don't like about it is that if this camera was that bad, like everyone says about it, why were you so excited about it and why you even considered the switch to Canon? So let's be respectful and rational. Both cameras are great. Period. When I'll get my hands on a7S III, I'll definitely make a side-by-side review and video test. So I had my hands on Canon EOS R5 and I wanna say it's a bold move from Canon. When I've seen the specs first time, I couldn't believe it's real, but here it is. This camera is the reason why the technologies grow so fast, why we get better and better technologies for less money. Like in the past, Canon 5D opened the boundaries to affordable cinema quality. Right now R5 is doing the same thing. The most exciting features in this camera to me is 10-bit in all modes possible and 4K up to 120 frames per second with no crop. 10-bit is a really big deal. The image right now has way more color information and it's so much easier to make a grade before the picture starts falling apart. That's great. 120 FPS in 4K. I'd be happy even if it had only 4K up to 60 frames per second. So 120 FPS is a huge bonus. And yeah, I know that Sony has 4K up to 120 FPS now, so probably it's a must-have for Canon to have it as well. I also liked a lot the IBIS. Now this camera is much easier to use in shooting some quick b-rolls or pickups. When I went to get some test shots, I took 70 to 200 with me, just in case. But turned out that I mostly used this lens for the evening, simply because the image stabilization is so stellar. Before, I couldn't imagine taking stable shots on 200mm other than with the help of tripod. And with this camera, 200mm in handheld looks just great. The stabilization is a big deal in this camera. EOS R had great autofocus, but autofocus in R5 is another level. It's so much snappier, you just know where you want to focus. The eye detection is just... Usually this kind of features like eye detection works only in a good lighting. In this camera it works in the darkness. Sometimes you look at the screen and you see only a silhouette and the camera actually detects an eye. So the autofocus is really improved in this camera. What surprised me is that 1080p in this camera is way more usable. Even in EOS R I had some hesitation in using Full HD, and it's not because I'm a resolution freak. I believe that 1080p is still a thing, and many projects just don't need to be shot in 4K. It's just sometimes you're forced to shoot in 4K in order to get a good looking 1080. Usually cinema cameras deliver a great 1080, and I'm glad that now Canon R5 can do that as well. Record limit. Maybe for some people it's a big deal, for me it's not, and it wasn't in EOS R as well. Of course it would be good not to have this limit, but I don't see a problem pressing the record button again if it reached 30 minutes limit. Usually I use this camera as a B-cam, and if B-cam cuts for a couple seconds during the interview, it's not that much a big deal. And let's remember, it's a photo camera at first. If your task is to shoot long videos where you can't cut, then maybe you shouldn't be considering this camera in the first place. For long recording time scenarios, you probably should buy a camera that's designed as a video camera. If you consider R5, it's not cheap. You can add a little extra and buy a Canon C200, which will definitely be a better video camera. I can record non-stop 24/7 if needed. This camera uses CFast Express card, and those cards are very expensive. 512GB card is gonna cost you about $600, and you really need that much media because the files are massive. But this card, I believe, is the reason why all these new cameras can actually record 4K up to 120 frames per second. Because before it was always a recording issue. We just didn't have fast enough media that could keep up with the high bit rates. So this media is 3 times faster than regular CFast card, and probably that's what makes it possible to record in these high frame rates. Codecs. That's a very disappointing part, because it bakes 10-bit image in H.265 compression. The files are extremely hard to work with. Even on my Mac Pro, it doesn't play smooth. And to my knowledge, Sony a7S III suffers with the same issues. Surprisingly, even 8K RAW plays smoother, so you'll have to generate proxies, which is a bummer, since it's time consuming. Or you can just record externally to an Atomos recorder and it'll make your life way easier on post. RAW format. There is not much to say about RAW format. The quality is stellar, the files are massive. It uses the same Canon RAW light as Canon C200, new C300 or C500, and you get C-Log 2 in this mode. That's very cool. You get way more dynamic range using C-Log 2. I wish all modes could be shot in C-Log 2 or at least C-Log 3, but fingers crossed. Maybe Canon will release a firmware update where it'll unlock these log profiles. What else changed? Some small fine changes in the menu system. Right now it's way more intuitive to choose what resolution you want to shoot, what frame rate or compression. I'm glad they got rid of 720p. That was in Canon EOS R. Who needs 720p really? Once I accidentally chose 720p on EOS R and I shot entire projects on this resolution. When I came back home, I was terrified. So now you won't get lower than 1080p if you, like me, tend to press accidentally something. Okay, the most concerned question about R5 right now. Does it overheat? Yes, it does, but what you need to do in order to actually overheat it. If you are using this camera the way it's intended to be used, I hardly imagine it'll overheat. Let's be honest, I'm surprised it's even capable of shooting 8K at all inside of such a small body, internally and with no active cooling. For instance, Red cameras have lots of fans inside their bodies and actually way bigger bodies in order to shoot in that resolution. And after a couple minutes of recording, the fans are getting very noisy. And anyway, I wouldn't shoot in 8K anything that lasts for long, simply because it's stupid. You'll need lots of media, the files are massive, the workflow is horrible. The real practical use of it is in shooting short clips, pickups, maybe some b-rolls. And by the way, even when it displays an overheat sign, it's not actually hot to the touch. The screen, body and even the batteries are slightly warm. My EOS R was way hotter sometimes and it didn't display any overheating. And yesterday I watched a No Life channel where he found a way to record externally up to 4 hours in 4K HQ mode, which is 8K downsampled to 4K. His trick was to use camera without SD and a CFast Express card, and even after 4 hours of non-stop recording, camera wasn't hot to touch. This morning I got to do the same test and my camera ran for 2.5 hours, after which I was just too tired to continue, because I've never had projects that I have to shoot non-stop that long. But it proves the point, meaning that it's not actually a heating issue, it's more an protective issue, or they simply protect their cinema camera lineup. I've heard so many complaints about overheated 4K 120 FPS after 17 minutes of recording. Really? Who needs to record 120 FPS for that long? When I shoot that slow, I usually shoot quick and short clips, simply because each minute in 120 FPS becomes 5 minutes. Why would you need to shoot 120 FPS non-stop for 17 minutes? The only scenario I can imagine in using 120 FPS for long is in shooting a music video performance for those who like to play with speed ramping. But even so, it's not gonna be longer than 3-4 minutes. So to me, it's nonsense to complain about overheating in this particular case. If you are the one who shoots everything in 120 FPS only, then you probably shouldn't be considering this camera at all. And probably not even a a7S III, because even there you can't record 120 FPS indefinitely. Realistically, if we were to choose to have this camera as it is right now, or just 4K camera and no 4K HQ and no 8K, what would we choose? I doubt we'd go with just 4K. You definitely want to have all these features as extra, as a bonus I'd say. And pretty much all the overheating issues are within using the bonus features. So many videos state that the regular 4K isn't good enough, but let's forget that we have 4K HQ and 8K. This regular 4K in resolution and sharpness is exact same as 4K in EOS R, and I personally think that 4K in EOS R is great. I don't even know why it needs to be sharper than that. Right now all the digital cameras are already way too sharp that many cinematographers use diffusion filters and vintage lenses to cut the edge of this sharpness. Many people use real film as image standard, right? Do you know that real film, even scanned as 4K image, is way softer than nowadays 4K from pretty much any digital camera? Really, 4K on R5 it's sharp enough. I'm a very picky person about picture quality, and after first day of using this camera, when I pulled up everything I shot on computer, I was very impressed. I mean, I expected this to be good, but I didn't expect this is gonna be that good. I personally have no complaints about regular 4K in this camera, and even if Sony 4K is a little bit sharper, you can add this amount of sharpness on pose if you want to match this sharpness. And quite honestly, straight out the camera, we don't know what kind of sharpening and processing are happening in Sony cameras. Downsides. Overheat definitely is a downside, but what probably is more frustrating is cooling time. It really needs some time to cool. And I expect real improvements with the firmware update, because it really feels that the camera is in overprotective mode or something like this. And overheat limits are based on timing and not actual temperature. Biggest issue to me is the codecs that are very hard to process on any computer, unless you edit on an iPad Pro, which actually handles the footage pretty easily. The codecs are really important because we don't want to spend too much time on creating proxies or converting. It's an extra step and it's time consuming. Weird that slow motion files are converted to 30 FPS only. Why not to give us an option to choose a project rate? Probably it will be fixed with an update. The camera has a real branding issues. The camera is very underappreciated, simply because of our human nature of liking or disliking things. Canon shouldn't have launched this camera as it is now. They should have released this camera as a camera that is capable of shooting up to 120 FPS and 4K recording in 10-bit with no crop. Everyone would be pumped about it even with those specs. They should have held on about releasing the whole potential of this camera. They knew that A7S III is about to be released, and after it's released, they should have made a firmware update that unlocks the 8K and 4K HQ features, and then this would have been accepted as bonus, which I truly believe is in this camera, and no one ever complained about overheating and etc. That would have been a big win in a way how users would accept it. Right now, Canon needs to pull the rope a little more in order to attract more users by unlocking C-Log 2 or at least C-Log 3, which will extend the dynamic range, which I'm sure is possible by a firmware update. That would be really cool. Conclusions. If you are considering to buy Canon Eos R5 or Sony a7S III, you are in a tough position right now. If you are already a Sony user, I doubt you are watching this video at all. I think all Sony users already made up their minds and worship the new Sony a7 III. And if I had a Sony glass already, I'd stick with Sony a7S III, not a brainer at all. What really waits on the side of Canon is EF glass. The thing is that in the past I've invested in Sony glass and I have lost a lot of money on it when I switched back to Canon because I had to sell all that glass. Sony lenses are more expensive than Canon glass and lose the value faster as well, simply because Sony glass can be used only on Sony cameras, where Canon EF glass can be used on a wide variety of cameras besides Canon, such as Panasonic, Blackmagic, Red, and etc. You can even buy an EF mount for high-end cameras like Arri Alexa, and there is no such thing like E-mount for any kind of cameras. I still have Canon glass from my old Canon 5D Mark II that I had 8 years ago and I still use it. I really like some accessories on Canon that competitors don't offer, like the RF to EF adapter with drop-in filters. And these filters is something that is missing the most when you come from using the cinema camera. Before R5 I picked up EOS R over A7 III. I switched from A7 III to Canon despite that on paper A7 III was a better camera, but in real world Canon was a lot easier and more pleasant to work with, and the image was much nicer, at least to my eye. Yes, I know that Sony has implemented their new color science in new A7S III. It looks really great from what I've seen. It's way better than it was before. But at the same time, it makes it harder for Sony users to use their cameras together in the multicam scenarios, because they all produce different colors, where Canon, like Arri, doesn't change much in their color science because they made that well in the beginning, and now it's easy to pick up pretty much any Canon camera and use it together. I doubt I'll have problem using EOS R and R5 together. I'm sure it'll look the same, and I can get the same colors and look with C200, new C300 and C500 as well. That's pretty much it. If you'd like me to make a test C200 versus EOS R5, please leave a comment below. If I collect 50 comments about this request, I will definitely make a video about it. I hope this information was useful for you. Thank you for your time. Bye.